Hello class, welcome to the lecture on network protocols, uh, formerly called authentication and key exchange protocols. So this lecture may be considered as a continuation of the previous lecture on some authentication primitives. Even though there are many different flavors of network protocols, the network protocols that we will be looking at in this lecture are primarily related to authentication, which is the task of determining identity. So let's get started. Okay, so the goal today is to understand key exchange basics. Of course, we have seen one form of key exchange, if you remember from last class, which was Diffie-Hellman key exchange, the very first form of public key cryptography, which was used to establish a common key between Alice and Bob. Uh, Following this, I will establish some simple protocols that are used even today, variants of which are used even today, and tell you the basic kind of uh, attacks that one has to consider when thinking about these kinds of protocols. So whenever one designs a protocol of this sort, one has to always think about the attacker model and how the protocol may be compromised. So there are various flavors of these. I will tell you about one important such attack, which is replay attacks. We will also look at things like man in the middle attacks and so on. Following this, we will look at something called symmetric key Needham-Schroeder protocol, which is a very important class of authentication protocols, um, and public key exchange protocols, digital certificates. Finally, even though it's not listed on the slide, the transport layer security protocol, which is also called TLS, used to be called secure sockets layer SSL. Okay, so for this lecture, we will be using a slightly different notation for encryption. And the primary reason we are going to be using this notation is because it is somewhat easier to write this on the when expressing a protocol. So, for example, if I say uh, X arrow Y, that means that's a communication from X to Y. X is sending some sort of message to Y, and the precise message that is sent is shown after the colon. Okay, so the message is at this point. So the message in this particular case is shown in this notation. So this is actually an encrypted message. So last class we wrote this notation of E subscript K of M to denote a message. We are going to be using a slightly different notation here. Instead of using that E, I'm just going to be using these parentheses. So the message that is encrypted is shown between the parentheses, and the key with which the message is encrypted is shown over here, right? That's going to be the notation we are following. And in this particular case, the message that is encrypted is Z concatenated with W. Okay, so we'll assume that there is some sort of a concatenation operator that allows us to concatenate two different messages, in this case Z and W. And the concatenation operator is reversible in the sense that if I ask the a corresponding reversible operation to take this Z concatenated with W, it will be able to produce for me Z and W. Okay, so we'll assume that this is an invertible operation of some sort, and this KXY is a key, and it's written KXY because it is shared between X and Y. Okay, so this denotes the fact that it is a symmetric key that is shared by X and Y. Okay, so in this particular case, X is sending the message that is produced by concatenating Z and W, and the whole thing is encrypted using the key KXY, which is a shared key between X and Y. Slightly different, we are just getting used to the notation. Here A is sending a message to T, and the message consists of two parts which are concatenated with each other, uh, where the first message is encrypted by this key KA, which I will explain in just a second. And the message that is encrypted is Z, so that's the plain text. And on the second part of the message, we have W, which is encrypted, and it's encrypted using K, A, comma T. Okay. Um, all right. So that's the way that we are going to be depicting messages in the next few slides. Uh, Throughout this discussion, we will be using a term called nonce. A nonce is nothing but a non-repeating random number, which is used to provide a measure of randomness, a measure of one-timeness to the messages. Okay, so we'll be using small r with a subscript of 1 or 2 or things like that to depict nonces. If you remember from the last class, we did have a notion of a nonce, and this was this unique key K that was used in the DSA, the digital signature algorithm. If you remember the DSS standard, the signature production part of it allowed you to create a nonce, which allowed you to create a unique signature based on the nonce. Even though it's the same message, you can customize it based on the nonce. So we did see the concept before, but now it's going to play a more major part. And we'll see that it's actually going to play a major part in preventing certain classes of attacks. Okay, so throughout the lecture, we are going to be seeing two kinds of keys. So we are going to be looking at what are called session keys or interchange keys, uh, which are uh, keys that are going to serve the purpose of a single session. Okay, and also more long-term keys such as public keys or private keys or even symmetric keys if you're using symmetric key cryptography. So if Alice wants to send a message M to Bob, and you assume that Alice and Bob are using public key encryption, uh, the what we will be assuming is that Alice will never send a message in encrypted with Bob's public key directly. That's rarely ever done. Rather, the way that things are done is that Alice will generate like a random number and use that as a key, random number of fixed length, and that cryptographic key is going to be called KS, and you're going to use KS to encrypt the message M. Okay, so the idea is that you'll be using this KS only for that message M, or for a small set of messages that are logically grouped together into something called a session. And so this key KS is called a session key. Okay, and then what she does is that she encrypts this key KS with Bob's public key and then sends it over to Bob. Okay, so KB, which is Bob's public key, is called the interchange key. And so essentially what happens is that once Alice and Bob establish this session, um, that session will be associated with this key KS, and then Alice will then encrypt all messages M with KS. And the reason is because the brute force attacks are known in the literature. Um, Messages may repeat, and you don't want to encrypt the same message with the same key, so that even if the attacker is able to learn that the same message was sent encrypted, you might see the ciphertext, and he might be able to glean some information. So you want to change these session keys, and we are going to assume that in the worst case, these session keys are actually weaker than these long-term keys, such as KB, which is Bob's public key. Even those keys need to be regenerated from time to time, and we will see that as well later on when we look at public key infrastructure later on in this very lecture. But this notion of session keys is particularly important because you rarely ever use the public key directly to send the message. In fact, what you see on this slide, the way that Alice is sending the message to Bob, is pretty much how TLS works. Okay, in the sense that TLS is used to establish a symmetric key, which then is used to encrypt a message. Uh, but there are various other aspects of TLS as well that are not covered on the slide, which we will cover later in this lecture. But this is the basic formula. Okay, so what are the benefits of using session keys? So the key benefit is that it allows you to limit the amount of traffic that is encrypted with a single key. So that even if that one key was somehow to be compromised or fall to the attacker's hands, the amount of traffic that the attacker can then uh, decrypt with that single key is limited to that one session alone. Okay, so you want to decrease the amount of the attack surface that is available to the attacker, even if that key were to be compromised. It also prevents certain classes of attacks that I was talking about in the previous slide. So, for example, let us say that Alice is a person who deals with stocks, and Bob is a stockbroker. We took this example in the previous class also. Okay, so Alice might send, let's say, a message of a particular format to Bob. So it could be a buy message or a sell message. Okay, maybe she just says buy or sell. Now, with if she were to just send the message encrypted with Bob's public key, what an eavesdropper such as Eve could do is that she could just encrypt both the messages buy as well as the message sell with KB, which is Bob's public key. Anybody can do that. And when Alice sends the message to Bob, let's say she does not use session keys and just directly uses Bob's public key, she would be using one of these two ciphertexts, right? Because that's what we had decided before. And so by just comparing the ciphertext to what Eve herself calculates, she can determine whether Alice is sending a buy or a sell message to Bob. So that's a very easy attack, obviously, and nobody ever uses public key encryption in this way. Even if they were to use public key encryption, they would typically take this buy or sell message, concatenate it with a random number, and then encrypt the whole thing with KB, right? But nevertheless, I'm telling you what can happen if you use these long-term keys for sending messages. Okay, so instead of doing this, uh, Alice will generate a random number, send that with KB to Bob, and then use buy or sell, use that key KS to encrypt this buy or sell. So that, even if uh, uh, Eve were to intercept the messages, she would not be able to make much sense. And even if she were to, let's say, get access to this key KS somehow by, let's say, brute force or dictionary attacks, the only thing that she would be able to compromise is probably that one particular message by herself. So note that when Alice next time communicates to Bob, Alice will be using a different session key. So even if Eve were to get hold of an old session key, there is not much that Eve can do at that point. So that's the idea. Okay, so let's look at basic key exchange algorithms, right? Uh, the goal over here is for Alice and Bob to get a shared key. So this key is ideally a session key, um, and it's a symmetric key that is used for symmetric key encryption between Alice and Bob. So the main constraint here is that the key cannot be sent in the clear, obviously, right? If Alice sends Bob the key in the clear over the wire, over an internet connection, the attacker can listen, and therefore, you cannot send it the clear. So the key can be sent encrypted, or it can be derived from data that's already exchanged between Alice and Bob. But the important point is that this data should not be known to the eavesdropper. So let's look at some. So we have looked at how to enable this using Diffie-Hellman key exchange, but let's look at some other methods of this key exchange. So one way of doing this is by assuming that there is a trusted third party uh, that is available in the setting where Alice and Bob need to deal with this trusted third party. So notice that Diffie-Hellman key exchange is also not a solution to this problem in its entirety. So even in in Diffie-Hellman key exchange, there are some public parameters that have to be relayed to all of the actors in the protocol. Alice should somehow get hold of Bob's public key, right? So somebody could claim to be Bob and present a public key, and I have not yet told you how Alice in fact authenticates Bob in that case, because at the end of the day, the Diffie-Hellman key exchange protocol relies on the fact that Bob knows Alice's public key and Alice knows Bob's public key. We haven't yet solved that problem. And even there, you will see that we will need to use this notion of trusted third parties. Okay, in that particular case, it's going to be called a certificate authority. We are getting there, but this notion of trusted third parties cannot be eliminated uh, entirely, even if we were to use something like Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So let's assume that there is some such trusted third party. We will call this trusted third party Kathy, and we will look at a family of protocols that enables Alice and Bob to establish keys between each other, these session keys. Okay, so our assumption in all of these protocols is that the steps of the protocol are going to be known publicly. So they are known to Alice, they are known to Bob, and they are also known to every attacker who wishes to compromise the protocol. And the protocol should remain secure despite the fact that the steps of the protocol are known. The crypto systems that are used as part of the protocol to encrypt messages, even those are known, right? The only things that are not known are probably the private keys or any secret keys and so on that Alice and Bob are using to derive any keys. Okay, anything that is transmitted from Alice to Bob, whatever is transmitted over an internet connection or a wireless link, is assumed to be known to the attacker. And we have to reason about the security of the protocols under these assumptions. Okay, so let us look at the classical key exchange problem, and of course the main issue here is that of bootstrap. So if Alice and Bob have to establish a key uh, that is only known to them, how do we even get started? Okay, so we'll assume that there is some sort of a trusted third party, Kathy, and we will assume that there is some out of band mechanism by which Alice and Kathy have established a secret key, okay, K. So this could be, for example, a system administrator that is establishing Alice's account in the system for the very first time. Okay, or maybe like a trusted party like VeriSign on the internet who is going to issue you credentials. Whatever it is, we will assume that there is this trusted third party, and that Alice and Kathy are going to share a secret key that has somehow been established for them without an eavesdropper being able to get their hands on this key. So this key between Alice and Kathy, well, following the notation that we established so far, it should be called KA, C. But because Kathy is this trusted third party, we will drop that C part and we'll just call it KA. So whenever I refer to this key with a single subscript KA, it means that it is actually between Alice and Kathy. That is supposed to be understood. Likewise, the key between Bob and Kathy is going to be assumed to be KB. Okay, assume that you have this setup that Alice trusts Kathy. There is a encrypted connection between Alice and Kathy using this key KA, and that this likewise there is a encrypted connection between Bob and Kathy. This is KB, and using this now Alice and Bob want to establish a shared session key KS. Okay, uh, for encrypted communication between Alice and Bob. So let us see how this is going to be possible. So here's a simple protocol. So Alice will send a request to Kathy saying, okay, look, I want a session key to communicate to Bob. So it could be some message formatted in some pre-specified format. And obviously Alice is going to send this encrypted with the key KA to Kathy. Now Kathy has this key KA, she can decrypt it. And so she sends back to Alice the following information, right? So she sends this key KS, she's going to generate a random number KS and send it back to Alice encrypted with KA. Um, and she's also going to send the same key KS encrypted with KB to Alice. So obviously, so these two parts are concatenated. That's the message that is sent from Kathy to Alice. Now, when Alice looks at this message, she can obviously decrypt this part of the message because it is encrypted with KA, but she cannot decrypt this part, right? And that's okay, right? So when Alice gets this, she can send it over to Bob. Now Bob gets this message over here. He can decrypt it with KB, and both of them have got now this key KS that they can use for any further communication between each other. Okay. Now there are okay. So that's the protocol. Um, oops. Uh, Let me go back. Okay. So that's the protocol. But this protocol has some problems, right? And the problem is that in this particular protocol, Bob has no way of knowing that he's talking to Alice. Somebody is sending this KS encrypted with KB and uh, claiming to be Alice. But how does Bob know that he's talking to Alice in the first place? right? It could be the adversary who is looking at the transcript of these messages over here. The adversary may be looking at the transcript of these messages. Eve may be looking at this transcript, and at some later point in time, she might actually take this message, strip out the first part, and then just send KS encrypted with KB to Bob. Okay, that's certainly possible. So that is called a replay attack. It's called a replay attack because Eve is recording the messages from Alice to Bob and then later on replaying it in some later session to Bob. Okay, so Bob may think he's talking to Alice, but in fact he is not. So replay attack is a big problem. There's also the problem of session key reuse, where Eve replays the message from Alice to Bob, so Bob is going to reuse the session key. So if you think about this buy or sell messages from earlier, if now Bob sends messages with the same session key, uh, and the messages from Bob are in a well-known format, you can just compare the ciphertext to the messages from the past and then figure out, okay, Bob sent the same message before as he's sending now, and gain some information. Okay, and that is pretty bad. You never want to uh, coerce somebody, an actor in this protocol, Alice or Bob, to reuse old session keys, right? The whole point of session keys is to use them for one session and then throw them away. And if you have somehow coerced one of the actors over here to reuse a session key, that is considered to be a bad thing in this protocol design. So the protocol must provide some measure of authentication. So when Bob gets a message, he must be able to determine, okay, that this message is in fact coming from Alice, and it should also provide a defense against these kinds of replay attacks. So let's evolve the protocol from the previous slide into something that will accomplish both of these goals. And that is the Needham-Schroeder protocol. In fact, what you see here is called the symmetric key Needham-Schroeder protocol. So let us see this. Okay, so Alice and Bob, at the end of the day over here, the goal is the same. Alice and Bob want to establish a shared session key KS for future communication where they can encrypt messages with this key KS. So we are looking at how this key KS is established. So Alice, this is, by the way, there are many variants of Needham-Schroeder. If you go look at a textbook, it's going to look probably slightly different. I'm presenting one of the variants of Needham-Schroeder. Okay. So you might ask me, look, why are the messages formatted in this particular way? No particular reason. There are different variants, but there is a core idea that I will get to. That is what is important. Okay. So Alice sends a message to Kathy, the following message. Okay, so she sends her name, she sends Bob's name, and she sends a random number R1. Okay, this is essentially telling Kathy, look, this is a message from Alice to Kathy for Alice to communicate to Bob. Okay, and this random number R1, which is the nonce. So now in response, what Kathy sends to Alice is this particular message. So she sends this huge thing over here, all encrypted under KA, which is the key that Alice and Kathy share. So what is it? It is saying, look, it is what I'm sending you now is a response to your prior message. So Alice and Bob and R1. So it's a response to your prior message. Here is a key KS for you to use for communication with Bob. And I am also sending you something that must be sent to Bob. Okay. So when Alice receives this message, obviously she can decrypt it. And so she can decrypt it and then verify that what Kathy is sending back to her is in fact a response to the prior message, right? So Alice is sending to Kathy her intent to communicate to Bob and then sending this random number R1 saying, hey, here's an identifier for this particular message. And what you can think of over here, the first part of this message is in some sense Kathy's acknowledgement to Alice saying, I am returning back to you a response to the prior message which you sent me with this random number R1. And you asked me for communication, a key to communicate with Bob, and I'm sending you that now. The key is that I'm sending you is KS. Use that key KS for communication with Bob. And by the way, send this stuff to Bob so that he also figures out what the key is. Okay, so Alice is able to decrypt all of this and she follows what Kathy basically tells him, which is forwarding this stuff over here over to Bob. So now Alice sends that stuff over to Bob. Okay, So it could be somebody pretending to be Alice, but at the end of the day, Bob will still know that it is in fact for communication with Alice and not this random person over here, because when he decrypts this message, he will see, okay, this key KS is for communication with Alice. Okay, so the whole thing is encrypted with KB, right? So only Bob can decrypt it. This key KB is something that Bob and Kathy share. So when he is decrypting this message, he knows that it is a message for communication with Alice. Okay, so that binds this key KS over here in Bob's from Bob's perspective for communication with Alice. So now key KS, as far as Bob is concerned, is bound for communication with Alice, and likewise for Alice also, this key KS is bound for communication with Bob. So both of them know, in fact, who this key KS is meant to for communication with, and so the problem of authentication is solved. Okay, all right. The problem of replay is also solved in some sense over here because we tied this R1 over here. I'm also coming to replay in the next step. But here is the message over here, right? So this is what allows the prevention of replay. So when Bob gets this, right, this message from Alice to Bob, immediately Bob sends a message to Alice with another random number R2. Okay, encrypted under this key KS. He wants to make sure that in fact Alice sent this message. Remember, any adversary who observes the transcript of this protocol can still have observed this third message and replay it to Bob. Okay, so Alice, if uh, so Alice may have done this protocol transcript long ago, and if Eve is observing this and then sending it to Bob, then what does Bob do, right? When Bob gets this message, he will see this key KS and that it is for communication with Alice. He will know that, right? Now, if he just uses this key KS blindly, he is going to be doing session key reuse for all future messages. So to avoid that, he wants to make sure that in fact Alice is an active participant in this protocol. And if Alice is in fact not an active participant in this protocol, this key KS would have been erased from Alice's memory because it's only used for one session, right? So if Alice is an active participant in this protocol, this key KS is still in Alice's memory. So she's using it for active sessions. So it'll be there, right? So what Bob does is that he generates this random number R2, which is this nonce, encrypts this with this key KS and sends it over to Alice. Now what he expects, but this is called a challenge. Okay. Now in response to this challenge, Alice responds back to Bob with some predetermined function applied to R2. Okay, so the function that is to be applied to this R2 is decided as part of the protocol structure. In this particular case, the example function that I've shown is just decrement the value of R2 by 1, right? It could be any deterministic function uh, that Bob and Alice agree upon beforehand, but that function over here is just subtract 1. Okay, so Alice subtracts 1 from R2, encrypts it with KS, and sends it over to Bob. Now Bob can verify that in fact Alice is active participant in the protocol because he'll decrypt it with KS and check that in fact it was 1 minus the random number that he sent over to Alice. So that prevents the replay attacks, right? It prevents Eve from just replaying this message because if Eve just replays this message, she will not have key KS. That replay, the goal of this replay was to force Bob to do session key reuse and send some meaningful messages encrypted under KS. But of course, now Bob is checking for that by using this next two messages R2 encrypted under key KS over to Alice. So even if Bob sends this over to somebody else who pretends to be Alice like Eve, Eve will not be able to decrypt this message. The reason that she cannot decrypt this message is because she does not have access to KS. She is just trying to get Bob to reuse the key KS, but that is now defeated over here. Okay, because Eve will not be able to produce this message. The way that Alice produces this message is by getting this message, decrypting it using KS, obtaining the clear text value of R2, applying the function to R2, which is in this case -1, encrypting that message once again, and sending it back to Bob. Okay, so Eve will not be able to accomplish any of that. And so therefore, this particular sort of evolution of the previous protocol addresses both the problem of authentication, which is the task of binding this session key KS to Alice and Bob. So it should be bound to Alice on Bob's side and should be bound to Bob on Alice's side. And it also solves the problem of replay. Okay, so this is called the Needham-Schroeder uh, symmetric key protocol. In fact, there is a entire authentication protocol that is implemented in file systems based on Needham-Schroeder. We are not looking at it in this course. I used to cover that protocol in quite a bit of detail in this course, in prior editions of this course, but this year I decided not to. That protocol is called Kerberos. So you might have heard about it. If not, I encourage you to go and look it up. It's called the Kerberos Protocol, Kerberos. Uh, it is almost entirely based upon uh, Needham-Schroeder, and it talks about how a user would authenticate themselves to a file system and or any system that serves resources and use it to authenticate themselves to that particular file system or resource serving system. It's almost entirely based on Needham-Schroeder. It has some advanced concepts called tickets, authenticators, and so on, but they're all essentially fancy concepts built on top of Needham-Schroeder. At the base of it and the core of it is Needham-Schroeder. It's symmetric key version of Needham-Schroeder. Okay, so let's look at the security argument and look at how the messages that Alice is sending to Bob, right? The second message which Kathy is sending to Alice uh, is, of course, encrypted using a key that only Alice and Kathy know, this key KA. So Alice has the assurance that in fact Kathy must have encrypted it, and Alice also has the assurance that in fact it's a response to the first message. It is a response to the first message because the R1 that is embedded in this message, encrypted under this key KA by Kathy, was in response to the R1 that was sent in the first message. Now notice that the first message is available to anybody, right? It can be observed by Eve. Doesn't matter. Eve cannot do anything because the message will be sent back to Alice by Kathy. Because that's what the message said. Alice Bob R1, right? So Kathy will send back the message to Alice, which in turn will start the Needham-Schroeder protocol from Alice's side also. So the third message which Alice sends to Bob was something that was created by Kathy. So Alice knows that only Bob can read it because it is encrypted under this key KB, which only Bob and uh, Kathy share with each other. Okay, so only Bob can derive this session key from this message by decrypting that message. Okay, and then what she will know as a result, Alice will know as a result, is that any future messages that are encrypted with that particular session key are supposed to be from Bob. Okay, so the third message from Bob's perspective, now let's analyze the security protocol. The third message is encrypted uh, with a key that only Bob and Kathy know, this key KB. So he will know that it is produced by the trusted third party, this Kathy. Okay, and furthermore, this particular message that was sent is naming Alice, right? It is Alice concatenated with this key KS, encrypted with this key KB. So it Bob has the assurance that this key was in fact provided by Kathy. The session key was provided by Kathy, and it's in fact naming Alice, which allows him to bind the session key to the identity Alice. It's for use all future communication with Alice. So the fourth message is used for fourth and fifth messages are in fact used to prevent replay attacks and session key reuse, right? So Bob is going to create this random number, send it over to somebody who is claiming to be Alice and sending him these messages. So if it is not Alice, then Alice will not be able to respond correctly, and if in fact it's the replay, Eve cannot in fact decrypt and obtain R2 and respond back correctly. And if it is not a replay, of course, Alice will be able to apply the well-known function, this particular case decrement, and send back the message correctly over to Eve. Sorry, to Bob.
So that's the security argument from Bob's perspective. Okay, so there are a whole variety of modifications, a whole family of modifications to Needham Schroeder that were introduced as various forms of minor weaknesses were observed in the protocol over the years. This was a protocol that was invented in the 1970s. So let us look at some of these modifications. So one of these modifications is called the Denning-Sacco modification, right? Uh, and over here, what the modification addresses is the fact that the original protocol assumed that all the keys are secret. And let us ask ourselves a question. Supposing Alice were to obtain some old session key, okay, and this might be possible because of brute force attacks. If the key space is small, maybe session keys are smaller. Maybe they're using 64 or 128-bit keys, and some adversary is just going to do a brute force attack by enumerating the space of all keys, encrypting messages, and then checking whether the key was used to encrypt the message, right? A brute force attack is one where you just enumerate over the entire key space. So with a 64-bit key space, that involves enumerating over 2 power 64 values, which is not a large number on modern computers. You can even parallelize it on a supercomputer, and you can do it in a matter of a few hours these days. So let's just assume that Eve obtains one such session key. And the question that the Denning-Sacco modification asks is, how does it affect the protocol, the security of the Needham-Schroeder protocol? So it is possible, right? If Eve knows KS, then what essentially happens is that the last three steps of the protocol can be compromised. Eve can replay an old message Alice concatenated with this known key KS encrypted under KB to Bob. And then when Bob responds back with this key KS, because we assume that Eve knows this session key, that Eve will be able to respond back to the challenge correctly. Okay. So this is, in some sense, a variant of the attack where Bob is tricked into reusing an old session key that somehow Eve has been able to determine using, let's say, a brute force attack. So Eve is able to impersonate Alice, and the replay happens from the third step onwards. Um, so what we are going to now propose is a solution from Denning and Sacco where they used timestamps to detect replay. Okay, so now in addition to this nonce, we are going to attach a freshness timestamp, which is a certain a timestamp is nothing but the date and time and so on that are embedded as part of the message, so that when the receiving party is able to get it, they are able to determine if the message is fresh. So let's look at that. See, here's the Denning-Sacco modification to the Needham-Schroeder protocol. So the first step is the same. The second step is where the first difference happens, where Kathy is going to attach a timestamp in this message that's sent to Alice, which is in some sense telling Alice, in fact, telling Bob and Alice that this session key is only valid for some time. Okay, so you're attaching this T to that encrypted message. Now Alice sends that over to Bob, and now what happens is that Bob and Alice are only going to use this session key KS until this timestamp expires. Okay, so it could be some date in the future, or maybe a few hours into the future, a period for which Kathy has determined that it is safe to use the session key. After this, new session keys must be used. Okay, and the rest of the protocol is the same. So how does this prevent the attack? Well, the Denning-Sacco modification, the idea is that even if Eve replays an old message, unless she does it before this timestamp expires, Bob will be able to detect it, because the first thing that Bob will do when he decrypts this message is he will check, is the has the timestamp expired? Is the key still safe to use? And if not, he can just discard this as a potential replay message. Okay, there is a small window during which Eve can still attack, which is before this timestamp expires. And we can assume that Bob is going to protect against such kind of attacks by keeping a history of recently used session keys and checking whenever a session key comes whether it's already appeared in that history. If it has, he will not use it. He will ask for a fresh session key. Okay. Uh, but once this timestamp expires, this key KS cannot be used anymore, And that's the Needham-Schroeder protocol with the Denning-Sacco modification. In fact, this is the exact modification that you will see used in Kerberos protocols, because the Kerberos protocols use timestamps as part of their messages. Okay, there's an important problem here that I have not spoken about, which is that when we talk about all of these network protocols, we are in fact talking about a distributed system. Alice, Bob, Kathy, all of these are different computers sitting at different places in the network. And whenever you're talking about different machines in a distributed system, the problem of clock synchronization happens. Not all of these computers will have perfectly synchronized clocks. In fact, some of these machines over here may even have clocks that are lagging behind or that are running forward. And these might be due to poor configuration or small imperfections in the quartz crystals that are there in the computers. For whatever reason it is, clocks cannot be perfectly synchronized in a distributed system. In fact, it's a very, very well-known problem. There's a whole paper that's written about it by Leslie Lamport, which you can go and take a look at. This paper is in fact called Time, Clock, and the Ordering of Events in a Distributed System. Nevertheless, right, the point that you should be aware of is that this timestamp that is generated over here has to be cognizant of this fact, the fact that clocks are not perfectly synchronized. And it could be, very well could be, that if Bob's computer, for example, is totally off sync, that the timestamp could be verified correctly by Bob, or it could this a correct message over here could be rejected by Bob. All of these things are possible, right? These are certainly possible within the realm of clock synchronization. And so the correctness of this protocol is modulo all of those facts that I told you. Okay, so yeah, that's the next slide, right? So if clocks are not synchronized, you may either reject valid messages uh, or accept replays. And so parties with either slow or fast clocks are vulnerable to replay. And resetting this clock does not really eliminate this vulnerability, because this clock skew can happen over time as well, even if you reset the clock. Okay, and then the problem happens, how do you all decide to reset the clock at the same time, right? So you're just lifting the problem up to one level. So the problem doesn't go away. And we'll see this notion of timestamps. We won't see it in this course, of course. As I said, the notion of timestamps is used in the Kerberos protocol as well. Okay, so now let's look at a second family of modifications to the Needham-Schroeder protocol. So this is called the Otways protocol, or the Otways modification to the Needham-Schroeder protocol. Again, it's a different way of correcting the previous problem, that of Eve replaying the third message in the protocol without the use of timestamps. Okay, so the use of timestamps, as I was saying, is sometimes problematic in a distributed system, and so this is a slightly different variation of that to get rid of the problem with timestamps. So here, what Otways thought about was, instead of using a timestamp, why not use an integer n to tie up all the messages that are associated with one session? Okay, and this integer n is going to be unique to that one session. Every time the session changes, you change the integer. It could either be n equal to n plus 1 or some new integer, doesn't matter, as long as you don't reuse these integers. So here is the Otways protocol, right? Uh, Again, this can be written in pretty much the same form that you saw before when you studied Needham-Schroeder with those 5 messages, but this is a slightly different modification. So let's just look at it. So Alice sends to Bob this message over here. She sends N. She sends Alice and Bob, and this random number R1 tied together with this nonce, Alice, Bob, and KA. So Bob is in this is able to decrypt it. Sorry, I think let me just. I think this is Bob, or no, this is yeah, this is Bob. Yeah, that's right. So instead of Alice talking to Kathy in the first place, Alice is talking to Bob. So Bob can only see this stuff over here in the clear, and this stuff he cannot decrypt because it's encrypted under K. Okay, which is the key that Alice and Bob share. So what Bob sends off to Kathy is the same thing that Alice sent him, but now he also takes this N and it attaches a second nonce R2 and Alice and Bob, and he encrypts it with the key KB and sends it off to Kathy. Okay, so Alice tells Bob, "Look, I want to talk to you." Bob sends back the message to Kathy like this, and now what Kathy does is that she generates the session keys. So Kathy generates the session key. Look, now Alice is sending a challenge over to Bob, over to Kathy, which is this R1. And Bob is also sending a message, a challenge to Kathy, which is R2. So Kathy generates this key KS and sends it back to Bob, um, which is this N, which is going to tie all the messages together. Notice that, an eavesdropper or a malicious person can change this N, but it it has to match the stuff inside. If it doesn't, the attacker is going to be found out. And when Kathy decrypts these messages over here, she'll check that these ends match over here. Otherwise, it is a replay from somebody claiming to be Bob. So Kathy generates this message N, binds it over to this R1. Remember, now R1 is bound to N, and so you don't really have to put N on the inside. As long as you have this R1 and this N in the clear, the R1 and the end are bound to each other. Same thing with R2 and N. So Kathy is going to send back R1 concatenated with KS encrypted under KA, and also R2 concatenated with KS encrypted with KB to Bob. Now Bob is going to be able to decrypt this portion of the message. Check that this N and this R2 are paired up. N and R2 are paired up over here. So this N matches this N and R2 are paired up over here. The same N and whatever R2 was used together with this N, that same R2 is used together with this N. He is able to obtain the value of KS and therefore he has got access to the session key. And then Bob sends this thing to Alice, same N, R1, KS and KA, and the same kind of verification Alice also does on her part, which is that she checks that this R1 that is used in the encrypted portion of the message was the same value that was paired up with N that was originally part of the message that she sent to Bob. Okay, so therefore she knows that all of these messages are tied up with the same N. Okay, so the things that are binding the steps of the protocol are N, R1, and R2, and they're binding all the 4 steps of the protocol. At the end of this step, of course, Alice can decrypt this portion of the message and is able to determine that KS is the key that was used. The freshness guarantee is also there because R1 and R2 were fresh challenges that Alice and as well as Bob generated to Kathy, and Kathy has responded to those challenges. So this key KS is in response to the fresh challenge from Alice and the fresh challenge from Bob. Therefore, freshness is also automatically guaranteed by the response that it is built into the structure of the protocol itself. Okay, so this is a way of solving that replay attack problem in the original Needham Schroeder protocol by instead using these counters or these integers that are used to tie up the steps of the protocol without having to resort to timestamps. So this is the Otway Rees modification. Okay, so the security argument, as far as Alice is talking to Bob is concerned, if this value n matches the first message, Alice knows that it's part of the protocol exchange. Okay, and she knows that Kathy generated KS because only she and Alice know this KA, and the encrypted part, which belongs to the exchange, the R1 matches whatever was sent in the first message. Okay, that's the security argument from Alice's perspective. From Bob's perspective, the third message, if the n matches the second message, Bob knows it's part of the same protocol exchange. And he also knows that key KS was generated that was by Kathy because only she and Bob know this key KB. And he also knows that the encrypted part belongs to the exchange because R2 matches the encrypted part in the second message. So that's the argument from Bob's point of view. Okay, so let's look at how this defends against replay attacks. So even if Eve acquires an old KS session key in this third step, um, and she, let's say, replays this particular portion of the message over to in this case from pretending to be Kathy to Bob, and or forwards it the so the message to Alice, forward the appropriate part to Alice, which part, this part over here. Alice will realize that she has no ongoing key exchange with Bob because n, this key, this value n over here that she's going to keep in her short-term memory will not match anything, right? She'll keep an active memory of this, of the set of identifiers associated with the protocol, and it will not match anything, and so it will be rejected. Okay, if Alice does have an ongoing key exchange with Bob, um, um, and if this n does not match, again it will be detected. And So if the replay just happens to be for the current key exchange, that is whatever Alice and Bob are doing now, and Eve sent the part uh, before Bob did. So if you go back to the protocol, and let's say that Eve sent this before Bob did, all that Eve can do is that she can listen to the traffic, but there's no replay. Okay, so she'll not be able to actually replay any of the old messages. That's the security argument for the Queries protocol. Okay, so all of these that we have looked at so far, of course, have involved a trusted third party, Kathy, and they have all involved only symmetric key encryption. There's no public key encryption involved so far. So now let's look at the problem of key exchange in public key when public key cryptography is used. And we will use the notation EA and EB to refer to Alice and Bob's public keys. In the real world, E comma N is supposed to be the public key. So we're just using a shorthand over here. EA is Alice's public key, EB is Bob's public key, and DA and DB are Alice and Bob's private keys respectively. Okay, they're only known to the owner. So now if Alice wants to generate such a session key, right, here is one simple protocol. Alice can just generate this key KS at random, encrypt it with Bob's public key and send it over to Bob. Okay, and Bob and Alice can then communicate. Of course, the problem over here is that anybody can send a message to Bob like this, claiming to be Alice, therefore establishing what is called a man-in-the-middle attack. Okay, so it is vulnerable to forgery. It's also vulnerable to replay, right? Anybody can also replay the message by just observing this, sending this message, and forcing Bob to reuse session keys. Okay, so here is a simple fix to it, which is that Alice encrypts this key case with her private key, okay, and then sends it over to Bob. So this will ensure that to Bob that in fact at least this key case was sent by Alice, right? That it was not from somebody else claiming to be Alice, but in fact it was Alice because only Alice could have encrypted this stuff over here because the private key is known only to her. Okay, so if you have uh, secret keys of this sort, you can actually exchange the session keys if both the Alice and Bob know each other's public key. Because that is very easy. So in the slide over here, I'm using a slightly different notation. KU is the public key. R is supposed to be the private key, and the subscript over here determines whether it's Alice or Bob. So Alice could send over to Bob a random nonce N1 together with her identity. The whole thing encrypted um, with the Bob's public key, and then Bob responds to Alice with another nonce N2. This is very similar in some sense to the last step of the Needham Schroeder, but what this N2 over here is saying is that okay, Bob is also responding. They're mutually authenticating each other, and it's going to be encrypted with Alice's public key. And then Alice over here responds back to Bob with this N2 that he just sent uh, with Bob's public key. So this allows Alice and Bob to mutually authenticate each other. Over here, it's somebody claiming to be Alice who is sending this message. Anybody can send this message, right? Any odd person on the internet can send this message claiming to be Alice because there's nothing over here that's unique to Alice. So Bob responds back to Alice saying, "Hey, you sent me a message and this is your public key. I know this is your public key." He gets it from some trusted third party and sends over this nonce. Now, only Alice can respond back with N2 because only she can decrypt it. Nobody claiming to be Alice can decrypt it because only Alice has the corresponding private key over here for this KUA. Now, once they do that, Alice and Bob have in some sense, authenticated each other. And then Alice can send over this message over to Bob, where she sends this key KS digitally signed with her own private key, right? So she's going to encrypt it with her private key and encrypt it with Bob's public key. So when Bob gets it, he can of course decrypt this, and then this part over here he'll decrypt with Alice's public key. All of this, of course, relies on the fact that Alice knows Bob's public key and Bob knows Alice's public key. That's a very big assumption we have made, right? How does Alice get hold of Bob's public key? So one way is if Bob is an entity who has a web page. Everybody knows where that web page is, and you're somehow able to go and look at the web page, establish that you're looking at the correct web page, and Bob decides to publish his public key over there. That's one way, right? You need to have some sort of trusted source from which you can obtain Bob's public key. In this particular case, the trusted source is Bob's website, which we assume has not been hijacked somehow. But not everybody has this facility, and this is probably not the right way, because now you're relying on the web being correct, the machine not being hacked, and so on for your public key, for determining the authenticity of the public key. So we need some other infrastructure, and that's called public key infrastructure. Okay, so over here we are assuming that Bob has Alice's public key and vice versa. If not, you should get it from some public server. And if you are unable to know for sure that Alice's public key, in fact, corresponds to this entity called Alice, and Bob's public key corresponds to the entity called Bob, you can launch a man-in-the-middle attack. Okay, so let's see that. Um, so here's a man-in-the-middle attack. So Alice uh, could send a request to Kathy. So Alice and Bob, they want to communicate with each other. They don't know each other's public keys. So Alice sends a message to Kathy, who is this trusted third party, saying, "Hey, send me Bob's public key." Okay. Now Eve is an attacker who is sitting in the middle. So she's a man in the middle, and she is intercepting this request. She's pretending to be Alice and sending the same request to Kathy. Send Bob's public key. So Kathy responds back to Eve with Bob's public key. And what Eve does is that she responds back to Alice, pretending to be Kathy, and instead responding with her own public key, EE. So now Alice, as far as she is concerned, she'll think Bob or Kathy has replied, and EE must be Bob's public key. So let me send a secret message to Bob, okay, and that is KS encrypted under EE. So Alice thinks that EE is in fact Bob's public key. She sends it over. Now you can decrypt it, right? She can she can intercept it, and she can also decrypt it, because E is Bob's is her public key. And then what Eve does is that she will now forward this key KS encrypted under Bob's public key, which she got in this step. So now Eve has become a man in the middle. She will pretend to be uh, she will pretend to be Bob to Alice and Alice to Bob, uh, and in the middle she is sitting and decrypting everything that Alice thinks that she's sending in the secret to Bob. So where is the root of the problem? The root of the problem happened in the fact that Alice has no way of reliably establishing that in fact this number that she is getting, E over here, in fact belongs to Bob. Okay, E is just a number. It's like 2048-bit integer or a 1024-bit integer or whatever the key standard is. E is just an integer. How do you tie this integer to an identity called Bob on the internet? There is no way of doing that, right? And that is what led to this man in the middle attack, because there is no way for Alice to confirm that this key over here, in fact, is Bob's public key. It is, if there was some way of establishing that, of course Alice will find out that this is not Bob's public key, because it's tied to Eve, right? But there's, in this particular run of the protocol, there's no way that Eve can differentiate. So what we want is a mechanism for us to tie public keys to identities on the internet. Okay, and that is what this cryptographic key infrastructure or public key infrastructure is. You want to bind an identity that is a key. The identity could be anything, right? It could be an email address, it could be an IP address, it could be whatever it is. It could be some physical identity, doesn't matter, but there is some identity that you want to bind to the key. Okay, so we are going to bind identity to the public key, and we will see the infrastructure that is going to be used to enable this. And we are going to assume that the actors in this protocol are identified by some acceptable name. It could be an IP address, it could be uh, email addresses, whatever it is. Okay. So what we will assume is that in order to enable all this, we are going to assume a trusted third party. The trusted third party is going to be called a certifying authority. Now, this is not something that is a made up concept. In fact, it's a very, very widely available concept. Um, um, there are a lot of these certifying authorities on the web nowadays. VeriSign is a very famous one. There is another one that's VeriSign actually does this certification for a fee. There are also free ones called Let's Encrypt. This has become a very, very popular uh, uh, certifying authority where you can go and create your own public key and get it certified by this entity called Let's Encrypt. Okay, so it's a certificate authority that's providing digital certificates for public keys. So let's see what this concept of a digital certificate is. Okay, so let's assume that there's some way of identifying actors in the protocol or principles of the protocol, and let's just assume that we are going to use names over here. We want to identify, we want to tie up the public key of that person with the person themselves. So the and that particular way of binding it and that message that binds the key with the identity is called a digital certificate. So a digital certificate generally consists of the identity of the principal, some acceptable identity. It's going to contain the corresponding public key. It's also going to contain a timestamp of when the certificate was issued, and also perhaps some other information such as the person who produced the digital certificate. The digital certificate is always produced by somebody called a certifying authority. And let's just assume that in this particular case, we're going to call this certifying authority Kathy. So the certificate is basically the public key tied up with identity, tied up with a timestamp, the whole thing encrypted under Kathy's private key. So we'll assume that trusted authorities are well-known authorities and therefore their public keys are known to everyone. So for example, the public key of VeriSign will be embedded in your browser, okay? So that whenever you get a digital certificate, somebody claiming to be Alice sends you EA, they will also send the corresponding certificate, which was now signed by this trusted third party, Kathy. And if you trust that third party as well, you can just go and take Kathy's public key, decrypt this message over here, and in fact, check that EA is bound to Alice. That's the purpose of these digital certificates. So digital certificates are nothing but digital signatures, but instead of being digital signatures of random messages, they are digital signatures of a message that ties up the public key of Alice with Alice's identity together with the timestamp and probably some other metadata such as the identity of the person that produced this digital signature. Okay, so when Bob gets Alice's certificate, and if he knows Kathy's public key, Kathy is a trusted third party, he can go and decipher or decrypt the certificate and check whether the certificate was issued within a reasonably recent time frame, check whether the person for whom this certificate was issued was in fact Alice, uh, and then therefore bind the public key that he just received with Alice's identity. Okay, of course, the main problem here is that Bob needs Kathy's public key to validate the certificate. And so if Bob does not really trust Kathy, or Bob is in a different country, or Bob is in a different administration zone than Alice, Kathy might not be his certificate authority. Okay. So the problem just get pushed up a level. And so what we have are this notion of what are called digital signature chains. Okay. The notion of signature chains happens from the fact that the internet is a very, very, very big place and that not everybody trusts the same certificate authority. On the internet, you'll find a ton of these certificate authorities. India will have a few such certificate authorities. For example, e-Mudra is one such certificate authority in India that provides digital certificates for people who wish to create public keys in India and bind their public keys to e-Mudra's certificate server. Okay, and in order to obtain such public key, you have to actually do something like a KYC, provide your Aadhaar number, provide your PAN number, and so on. and they go verify your identity, issue you a public key together with a, digital certificate. IISc is in fact doing it for all staff members now. We have e-mudra uh, digital certificates for example, for things like purchases for the institute that faculty and staff have to make. We have to do it with our digital signature now, right? So that's there. Likewise, other countries have their own digital certificate authorities. Let's Encrypt is another one that's over the internet for that's doing a lot of this work. So we create this problem of what are called certificate signature chains, because my certificate authority might not be your certificate authority. Okay, so the idea is that you create a certificate and you generate hash of the certificate, and then you encrypt that using the issuer's public key. And so, the problem, of course, is in validating it, because I might not know what your certificate authority's public key is. And so you have to create these chains. So one such implementation of such a chain is this X509. It's a standard certificate standard. So the certificate authority, CA, issues certificates. And if you have multiple such issuers, you have a validation problem. Okay, so let's just assume that Alice's CA or certificate authority is Kathy, and Bob's CA is this entity called Don. So if Alice gets Bob's digital public key together with the digital certificate of Bob's public key, how does Alice validate Bob's certificate? Because it's not going to be signed by Kathy, who is Alice's CA, but rather Bob's CA, who is Don. So the idea is that Kathy and Don, who are trusted third parties, or in this case certificate authorities, they will cross certify each other. Okay, so Kathy will uh, produce a digital certificate for Don, Don's public key, and Don will produce a digital certificate for Kathy's public key, so that they each have each other's public key in hand. Okay, and every such trusted third party will sign for everybody else. And you can imagine that this need not be a two-level hierarchy. This can actually be a multi-level hierarchy, where if Kathy is unwilling to do it for Don, maybe Kathy has her own certificate authority, and Don has his own certificate authority, and those two are able to cross certify each other. So you can imagine like a tree-like hierarchy where this cross certification happens at some level or the other. Okay, so this is how cross certificate happens, and I'm going to show by this greater than and less than sign who is producing the certificates. So Kathy is producing a digital certificate for Alice, Dan is producing a digital certificate for Bob, but Kathy is also producing one for Dan, and Dan is also producing one for Kathy. And if this is the case, here is how Alice would verify Bob's digital certificate. Alice would obtain from Kathy Dan's public key, and because Alice trusts Kathy, she knows that Dan's public key is correct, because Kathy is saying so and she trusts Kathy. And then Alice uses Dan's public key, which Kathy has then certified, to then go and validate Bob's public key, which has been signed by Dan. So it's two level of verification. So Alice trusts Kathy, and because she trusts Kathy, she will know that it's Dan's certificate. Okay, and then Dan has signed Bob's public key, and so uh, Alice is sort of uh, believing now Dan in that Bob's public key is authentic. So Alice trusts Kathy. Kathy has cross-certified Dan. Dan has signed Bob's. Therefore, Alice, by a chain of trust, knows the authenticity of Bob's public key. Those are called digital certificate chains. Of course, the problem now happens when, see, remember, whenever we spoke about digital certificates and digital and public keys, we also spoke about timestamps. So the timestamp over here is used to determine the validity period for a public key. A public key might be valid for a period of 1 year or 2 years, but you have to regenerate public keys, right? Your public key, once you generate, is not good for eternity, because you have to assume that attackers are also conducting brute force attacks. So the advised period to regenerate your public keys, different organizations have different policies, but generally 1 year or so, people refresh their public keys. Okay, but the problem is that if you've got a public key and you've got a digital certificate that's been issued by, let's say, your certifying authority, every time you refresh your public key, you should also get a new digital certificate, and that's not a problem. The problem is to tell everybody else who has got in their private records the fact that EA is your public key. You should tell them, look, that's no longer my public key. You have to erase that and then use a new public key. This is like, when you change your phone number, you have to go and tell all your friends to change, uh, in their contact list, in their respective contact list, your phone number. You have to erase the old phone number and put a new phone number. Exactly the same idea over here. Okay, except that because we are now talking about a digital infrastructure for public keys, we would also talk about the digital infrastructure to deal with such key changes, and that particular thing is called key revocation. Okay, so a key could be invalidated before expiration, or maybe somebody left the company and you have to regenerate public keys again for everybody. Whatever it is, right? You have to deal with this problem of key revocation. So certificate authority can also issue what are called revocations, key revocations, uh, where they produce a list of keys that have now been revoked, so that anybody who is now uh, going to that certificate authority can go and consult that list and check whether the public key that they have just got from someone has been revoked or not. Okay, so uh, maybe there's maybe somebody's working for IISc. They get a public key that is signed by IISc's authority, certifying authority, and then they leave IISc. That public key should no longer be used because they are no longer an IISc employee. So these things are called certificate revocation lists. Okay, so a certificate revocation list is something that's issued by a certifying authority that's going to list that's going to provide a list of all digital certificates that are revoked public keys. Okay, so in X509, only the certificate issuer can revoke the certificate. So the certifying authority can issue such a revocation certificate, and it's added to the CRL. CRL stands for Certificate Revocation List. Okay, PGP, which is another standard for public keys, it follows a slightly different uh, 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 system than X509. Here, instead of just the certificate issuers being able to revoke the certificates, in fact, signers can revoke the signatures. Owners can revoke the certificates, and you can also allow others to do so. Both of these are public key infrastructures, but they vary slightly in their implementations, right? As you can see over here, PGP is pretty good privacy. X509 is a standard for public key crypto. All right, so that is it about public key cryptography and key exchange and so on. I still have one important portion left, which is TLS. So that's now that you know Needham Schroeder, you know how keys are exchanged with the combination of public and private keys. You will actually see the TLS is a pretty straightforward extension. You have also learned about man in the middle attacks and digital certificates and all of these concepts. It is just a combination of all of these concepts. Okay, so I'm opening the same thing. So let us open the previous lecture slides, at the end of which we have TLS, which is called SSL, but it's the same thing. Uh, so TLS is now at version 1.3. There are, of course, changes from 1.2 to 1.3 and so on. We are not looking at the specifics of any version. Uh, if you are interested in research on these topics, you should. I'm just going to give you a very high level idea over here. So the secure sockets layer, or SSL, or the more modern version of it, which is called transport layer security, or TLS, it's, as the name suggests, it's a transport layer security service that was originally developed by Netscape, and the version 3 is actually been designed with significant public input. Okay, so TCP provides reliable end-to-end uh, network transmission of packets, and TLS in fact builds on top of it, right? And you can in fact build other application layer protocols on top of TLS. So HTTPS is nothing but HTTP built on top of TLS, right? HTTP is an application layer protocol, and TLS, of course, is the transport layer. So you can just build on top of TLS and you get HTTPS for free. So the SSL protocol stack is basically like this, right? So you've got IP and you've got TCP on top of it, and you've got something called the SSL Record Protocol. All of these things are built on top of the SSL Record Protocol. HTTP, you can have SSL alerts on top of it, SSL Handshake. All of these things are built on top of the SSL Record Protocol. So let's look at the SSL Record Protocol. It provides both message integrity as well as confidentiality. Uh, so let's look at confidentiality first. So all messages are uh, exchanged between Alice and Bob, who are going to talk with TLS. They're going to be exchanged by symmetric key encryption. Okay. So Alice and Bob, whatever messages they exchange, the messages that they exchange are going to be encrypted with a symmetric session key. And this key, this shared session key, is now going to be defined by the handshake protocol, which I will go over. Okay. You can use whatever encryption algorithm, symmetric encryption algorithm, as long as you declare it upfront as part of the handshake protocol. AES, IDEA, you can use also, stream ciphers, they can be used. And the message is compressed before encryption. Okay, that's the confidentiality part of it. Every message is also tagged with a MAC, message authentication code. So every message is tagged with a MAC that is, of course, produced using a shared secret key, and that provides message integrity. Okay, so you get both confidentiality as well as integrity using TLS. Okay, so the record protocol, it works like this, right? You take the application data and then you fragment it to chunks because you're going to apply a block cipher. You compress it, right, using a compression algorithm, right? So the blocks are of now fixed size. You add a MAC, right? You compute a MAC on this compressed piece of data, and then you encrypt it, right? So the stuff over here is an encryption of the integrity protected compressed text. You append the SSL record header and then send off this packet. On the other side, you strip off the SSL record header, you decrypt the packet, and then you check the MAC, and then you uncompress and you obtain the original text. Okay, encryption provides confidentiality. The MAC provides you to a means to check uh, the integrity of the message. Okay, you can also change the cipher spec in the middle of the protocol, right? You can tell the client that you're going to change the cipher that you're using. That is part of the change cipher spec protocol. We're not going to look at much detail. Our main attention over here is going to be limited to the handshake protocol, the SSL handshake protocol. Okay. Similarly, there's an SSL alert protocol that talks about SSL related alerts, right? It could be, maybe there's a MAC failure that happened, right? A MAC verification failure. This could happen because of not just attacks, but also transmission errors. So all of these things, whenever there is a problem that happens, you will get an SSL alert. And the alert will allow you to determine whether something went wrong. But of course, let's look at the handshake protocol, which is the key aspect of the SSL protocol that allows you, Alice and Bob, to establish the session key in the first place. So SSL or TLS at its heart is uses symmetric key encryption for all communication between Alice and Bob. The symmetric key encryption is is done using a session key, and the session key is established using public key cryptography. So we do assume that Alice and Bob do have uh, a mechanism and public keys that allow the server and the client. I'm going to be referring to server and client, Alice and Bob, to authenticate each other. Okay, so they must authenticate each other first, in the sense of knowing each other's public key. Once they know each other's public key, then using one of the methods that we discussed in the previous class, in the previous set of slides, once Alice knows Bob's public key and Bob knows Alice's public key, Alice can just encrypt this session key that she generates, sign it, and then send it off to Bob, encrypted using Bob's public key. Bob decrypts it and then uses that session key for all communication with Alice in that session. But of course, the question is, how does the server and the client, how do Alice and Bob, first of all, verify each other's uh, uh, public keys? And that's the job of the SSL handshake protocol. And in fact, one of the saddest facts about SSL and TLS is that even though SSL and TLS provide a great degree of security, and in fact, things like Gmail, Google Drive, and so on are TLS enabled by default these days. The problem happens today in certificate validation. Okay, so the SSL handshake protocol over here is just this: the client and the server exchange some hello messages saying, "Look, this is my intent to talk to you," and the server's acknowledgement. Following which, it's just actually just an exchange of certificates. The server sends its public key to the client, together with which it sends a certificate. Okay, um, so the client is supposed to get the public key of the server and verify the certificate. So the client is actually supposed to go and contact a certificate authority, possibly using certificate authority chains, and verify the server's digital certificate. Okay, and then once that is done, the client also sends their own digital certificate to the server, which is also supposed to be verified by the server. And then once each other verify uh, their uh, their digital certificates, at which point in time the client knows the server's public key and the server knows the client's public key, following which they can exchange uh, a symmetric key. Okay, either the client or the server can generate a symmetric key, and then they encrypt it using the each other's, so the client encrypts it using the server's public key and also digitally signs it with his own or her own private key. The server can then, at that point, decrypt it, check the digital signature, and then use that session key. But the most important aspect of the SSL handshake protocol is that this certificate has got to be sent by the server to the client, and the client has to send their public key to the server together with a certificate, and the certificate has to be locally validated. Okay, if you don't locally validate the certificate, it is a big problem. In fact, you might have noticed this if you log into a new machine for the first time. Let us try to log into a new machine for the first time. Uh, I will have to log into my machine over here, to the VPN, IISc VPN. Let me just go and show you. Um, okay, so I have an account on Drona, uh, where I have logged in from my desktop machine. But let me just go and erase. So every time um, I log in using SSH or TLS, you know, it actually it asks me what are the known hosts, and my known host over here, my desktop machine is that. Let me just I erase the known host. Now let me go to my desktop machine. This is my desktop machine in my office. Okay, uh, and I've logged in. Okay, now once I log in, let me go and try to log into Drona. Now, Drona is a server that's sitting in in IISc, and this is my desktop machine. I'm trying to SSH to Drona. The first time I do an SSH, um, actually, if Drona does not know who I am, I'm just a random machine trying to connect to Drona. It's going to send its public key and ask me to accept it. Oops. So I was able to log into Drona, but from Drona, now let me try to log into my this. The reason I was able to log into Drona is because Drona's public key is known to my desktop. But if you remember just now what I did, I erased the public key of my desktop from Drona. Okay, so now when I log into my desktop from Drona, you see this message over here, right? Drona does not know the identity of my desktop, right? The authenticity of this host cannot be established, and here is the EDSA key fingerprint. This is a way, this is in fact a SHA-256 hash of the digital certificate. And it's saying, look, this is the digital certificate SHA hash. Do you really want to continue connecting? If I click yes over here, in the real situation, when I do an SSL connection, I'm actually supposed to go and verify this key fingerprint with a certificate authority. If I don't do that and just say yes, what will happen? This my desktop is going to be added to the list of known hosts, trusted hosts in Drona, and the connection will continue. But by saying yes over here without checking the key fingerprint, I'm actually assuming on myself the responsibility for a man-in-the-middle attack. Okay, um, and so you see over here, it added my desktop to the list of known hosts. This DSA, ECDSA is nothing but DSA, as you can imagine, right? It is the It's the digital signature standard. So ECDSA is an evolution of the DSA that's actually providing me a digital signature of my key, and that's the digital certificate. That's the step over there where I was supposed to go and verify the public key. I did not. I just said yes. In doing so, I am trusting my desktop's public key, my desktop's declaration of its public key, and so that is the in some sense the certificate validation. In the real world, the certificate validation involves the server and the client each going to their certificate authorities and checking whether the public keys match. Here, it's just pointing to the end user a simple yes or no uh, based on which I was able to log in. And so that is the SSL protocol or the TLS protocol in a nutshell. Okay. So that concludes the lecture on network protocols. Um, so we have done a fairly um, uh, broad and wide job of covering a wide variety of these network authentication protocols. And this, in some sense, is part 3 of the lecture on authentication network protocol mechanisms. So hope you enjoyed, and that ends this class.